This is a production of Cornell University.
So thank you for coming today. Today I'm going to do a talk that is a little bit different than the technical talk I gave in plant breeding a couple weeks ago. If you're watching on YouTube, it's maybe in one of the channel of videos around this portion of your screen. But here today, so I just want to talk about some things we do in more than the art side of breeding and some of the trends and things we are looking to influence to try to maybe give us some more opportunities in what different crops we can breed. Okay. And so in plant breeding, much of what we do aligns with some grand challenge questions. Feeding a global population, looking at sustainability in various facets, climate change, addressing malnutrition throughout the world, and being able to keep up with evolving and dispersing pests and pathogens that are coming to challenge our crops. And there's a lot we do to directly address these, but in the process, the topic I want to integrate today, and we'll explore in a couple different stories, some you're familiar with, some might be new, is reducing waste in the breeding process itself, and not necessarily looking at directly in the waste. There's a lot of the squash that is left over from our breeding program that ends up going to the food pantry, left from trials. We've been distributing the leftovers from our genomic selection populations around before Thanksgiving. So there's some direct waste, but there's also just some wasted opportunity in the breeding process. So that's one of the main things I want to talk today and really bring it back to the market class concepts and demands of the marketplace, and to see if we can influence them, we can maybe influence how much progress we can make. Okay. And so the one of the main challenges we work on, and so this pest, this is a striped cucumber beetle, is a specialist herbivore feeding on cucurbit crops. You've probably heard from myself or my student Lauren about how these beetles just are specialized to feed on cucurbit crops. They will lay their eggs at the base. They sequester some of the bitter compounds in the plants used for their own defense. And if you have a winter like we did last year, or it looked like we might have this year, remains to be seen, we really didn't have the killing, the really low temperatures to really reduce the beetle populations. And so there were swarms everywhere, and it was one of the most challenging years for a lot of cucurbit growers that I've heard of. And just really thinking about climate change and how those mild winters are going to intensify this problem. So from the breeding perspective, what can we do? And it's important to think about it from a plant breeding perspective, because as we look at some of the chemical controls we have and we've relied on, breeding for resistance to these insect pests, and probably many insect pests, has lost a lot of attention because of the cheapness and efficacy of a lot of the pesticides we've had that really do a really good job of eliminating this pest. The challenge and the increasing scrutiny these pesticides have is, as you can see, these insects are attracted to the flowers. There's a lot of nectar in the flowers, pollen, protein, and that's also where the bees are feeding. And so as we're starting to scrutinize neonicotinoids and their use and how there might be some interaction with pollinator health, having some alternative, and if we can find one within the plant, that would be an ideal solution. Right. And we initially approached this how many people have before, starting to do some field assays of beetle damage, where you can see there are some plants and some plots that are green and thriving, and other plants where it's noticeably, well, the plants are rather absent. The beetles just devoured them to the ground. And as we sorted through this, we definitely focused originally on those extremes. Right? And a slide we've shown a few times before. So on the top we have 6SPM, a straight neck summer squash, developed here at Cornell by my predecessor, and also very popular in organic systems. Organic seed is broadly available with this one. On the bottom you see a golden zucchini. And this is a crop where the beetles really prefer it. They've defoliated it, and also in the process, the plants that have escaped that have gotten bacterial wilt and then will die from that. And there's been a lot of people that have looked at some of the recommendations and trying to figure out, so what can a grower plant that's really going to be able to give them a crop that will be less vulnerable to these beetles? And they've often looked at different cultivars that are popular at the time. We took it one step further, and looking at all the different market classes and the amount of defoliation damage we saw, there's definitely a trend, and you can order the market classes through increased damage. And further, where the biology really comes into play is it turns out there's a really nice demarcation in the middle where of all these squash you eat, pumpkins, jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, acorn squash, zucchini, coquezel, there's two different subspecies, two separate domestication events, and there's a clear distinction in preference based on the same subspecies decline. So on the top you see the summer squash that are getting very little damage, a member of the subspecies fenna, and on the bottom the zucchini, a part of the pepo. And so how this relates to some of the market class questions is one thing it really comes down to, those two extremes I was showing, genetically they're very different. To the beetles, they're very different. To consumers, they're still different, but to what degree could they substitute, right? So here is that yellow summer squash. On the far side is a golden zucchini. You have two yellow summer squash fruits. Once you put a balsamic marinade and put them on the grill, how different might they be? But still, there is a drive in the marketplace to have these two different market classes and use them differently, or at least the demand to have access to both. Indeed, the zucchinis tend to be a little bit more preferred in the marketplace, which is, again, a question that comes back to sustainability, because the yellow summer squash, they have multiple flowers per node, and actually much higher yielding. So you have, it's kind of the more sustainable choice. Okay. And further, looking at all of the different market classes here, what you see for breeders, often what we do is to try to be able to continue to make progress the most rapidly. Many people do conservative crosses. You seldom see crosses across the subspecies, and often you'll see crosses within a market class. And so the amount of gain you can stand to make is quite narrow, quite restricted. Okay. But we have started doing many of those crosses, and so here's a population between those two contrasting squash I showed, and you can see the selection process here after Lauren has gone to the field and vacuumed up thousands of beetles to put into these cages, and you can see there's some clear preference differences as we have these segregating populations. Some plants defoliated, some plants still have a full intact leaf. Okay. And so here, we're doing a cross between the two, and one question we're going to have is, so at what point are we going to be close enough to a golden zucchini? And in this time that we're doing the breeding, to what extent can yellow summer squash substitute in the marketplace? It's really a market class drive we're doing here. And so in terms of being able to have just a good summer squash, it's well, that already exists. The true alternative that we are very excited to be starting to work on, and it's something where I myself need to be kind of persuaded down this road to explore. This is an Italian summer squash. This is a tromboncino summer squash. They are part of the moschata species, so rather than being between those two subspecies, its own species. And they can be used as a winter squash, the butternut squash you might be enjoying this week. In addition, they can be used as a summer squash. In our work to look at some of the climate change aspects, we often have trials in the southeast because that's a good predictor of the climate we might have to come, and the growers are working through many of those challenges now. And one of the key differences that makes this tromboncino more sustainable is nearest to me on the right, you have a zucchini stem. It is hollow and very susceptible to squash vine borers. They get in that passageway. They're very hard to control once they get in. On your left, you have the solid stem of one of these moschata species, so just naturally much more resistant to the vine borers because they can't really burrow in and just have a subway system through the plant. Right? But this was the tromboncino is an heirloom. There's a lot of room to improve. And so this is where we started to get some of the great input from the team at Blue Hill and Chef Dan Barber as we look through to see, so what are the characteristics we do need to preserve in these Tromboncino squash as we start to breed with them, and then understanding, so how can they best be displayed in a dish. And so you have some different uses where you find the Tromboncino, they're much more delicious than a zucchini. They have flavor, and so if you've ever thought about where's flavor in zucchinis, well, there are some classes that they do have some great flavor, but also here in a Tromboncino, you get a lot of flavor, there's a lot of density to it, and this became a very popular offering there. Right. And this model is something that we have, we're very optimistic for how it'll work with the Tromboncino because of the great success we've had in the past. And so the honey nut squash, you know, hopefully know and enjoy now, is here on the bottom corner. And it wasn't something that originally took off because it looked different than is on the marketplace. The Tromboncino is going to look different than the summer squash. With the growers we talked to, that's one of their major concerns is how are they actually going to get it in the marketplace? It's a crop they know that works for them. But so how do you get that culinary trend to catch on? Well, the chef is the key. So honey nut is a small squash. It has a built-in ripeness indicator. You can tell when it's fully ripe. It'll change from a green to an orange rind, and is much more delicious, at least I'll tell you, than any other butternut squash you'll have. And the key within that is that it has a cross that was done many years ago. Dick Robinson at Geneva started the process. Molly John continued it. But it's a cross between a butternut squash and a buttercup squash. And that yielded the honey nut squash, which, as I've talked about some of the technical aspects before, this is an exciting crop both for how good it is itself. It's much sweeter, much smoother texture, then owes much of that to the buttercup in its pedigree. But also it has about twice the beta carotene, more than 3 times the lutein, again as much alpha carotene. So it's really an antioxidant nutrient powerhouse there. And it's also been serving the basis for further genomic selection work we've been doing. The reason it had some challenges getting into the marketplace and the kind of what's helping it now is that it's distinctive, right? And so it's smaller, it has that orange rind. If you're growing in your garden, it's starting out dark green. So it took a while for that to catch on. It was getting that popularized, so then when it did catch on, now we're getting a privilege that's normally reserved for apple cultivars, where it's sold by name in the grocery stores. It has a SKU code that's specific to it. And so all the work we've done in being able to create something that's really delicious is identifiable so consumers can go back to find that experience, and they can know when it's ripe and at its peak, is all coming together. And this is something we can do hopefully for many of the other varieties I work on. The ripeness indicator is a trend we're putting into all our squash. It's really hard to tell whether a butternut squash is ripe or not otherwise. And also just an example of one of the trends that we now know we can drive. A couple others where we are creating some crops that don't necessarily fit in the existing molds is our work with some purple snow peas. And so this is exciting to us for the color. There's, of course, an antioxidant boost that comes with the anthocyanins and associated flavonoids. But these are a little different, and they're a little different because they're not a perfectly straight. And so in pea breeding, a lot of effort has gone into making the pods perfectly straight. The challenge we find when it comes to being able to incorporate them into food is where we have a few of those in a stir fry. It works very well. It's pretty. They mix in. But once you start to add more than a certain amount, they start to look a little bit like the truckloads of firewood that might have been dropped off at your houses. So there's just kind of that pile of them, and they all just kind of stack together. These, as you can see, have a curl to them. They have this wavy nature that actually is really cool and interesting because it gives them loft. And so they just have much more presence, appearance on the plate. And as you are starting to work with them, share it, it is actually just something that's more interesting to work with and present, in addition to all the work we've done on getting the flavor to be sweet and overcome some of the astringency of those purple flavors. There's some often some bitterness and astringency associated with the accumulation of anthocyanins in crops. The other example where we're just having fun and creating new types of, in this case, peppers, and so just trying to do some things to really increase the market appeal. You see those little snacking peppers that you'll see increasingly on the vegetable trays you'll have at gatherings. It's great to see that they are one of the first vegetables to go off the tray, but we can increase the consumption even more. The vitamin C content in these is also through the roof. Right? And so there's this novelty in looking at flavor and quality, and then also being able to capture some insect disease resistance with the tromboncino. There's also work we do on another pathogen, cucurbit downy mildew. There's a lot of this work I do with Chris Smart. And the resistance we had to downy mildew, it wasn't really an issue for many growers for quite a few years. For a few decades, there was some resistance and been bred in that held really well. The challenge we faced is we started to get some new races, some new strains of the pathogen that were starting to overcome the existing resistance. And so you'll have some telltale symptoms on a cucumber leaf, and then once it occurs in an area, it rapidly defoliates the crop. And so on the bottom left, you can see just a little bit over just 10 days of disease progress for this pathogen. So once it moves in, you go from having a productive crop to nothing very quickly. All the downy mildew resistant cultivars that were out on the market, the pathogen has overcome that resistance. And toward that, we started to do some, this is some work at Peter Ojambo in North Carolina, and looking at how we can track the pathogen. One thing you can see, it's kind of restricted to the East Coast. We can watch how it moves through the year, and with some special emphasis, which has been on some of the major areas in the Carolinas and Michigan, where a lot of the pickle production happens, and then up in our area in New York, it often arrives later. But this is a pathogen that's being dispersed. It is probably overwintering in protected structures around Michigan, whereas we try to have this global continuous supply of cucumbers year-round. That leads to we're growing cucumbers year-round, and the pathogen is present year-round. And especially as tropical storms move up the East Coast, as those increase, we often get much more and sooner the dispersal of downy mildew up the coast. And so, this is a pathogen that interacts with some of our food system issues on a large scale. And the most direct way you would interact with it is if you were growing cucumbers in the fall. You'll see that your plants just quickly die. In all the regional local food markets, all the cucumbers are lost at some point in the fall, not just because of the frost of the season's ending up, but this pathogen is moving in, and the fungicides are losing their efficacy as it continues to rapidly evolve. So we've been excited when we can be able to have a major change in disease resistance for this. So our two most resistant varieties on the top, so varieties that are now commercially available, I'll talk about now, compared to some of the other options growers had as they turned to something that had improved downy mildew resistance, or was just one of the heirlooms, a typical crop cucumber cultivar they had been growing. Excitingly, and also, and as I showed you that map of how downy mildew is coming up the East Coast, this is a trial. It's a beautiful location our collaborator Janine Davis has in North Carolina. And you can see in the foreground, as downy mildew starts to move in and take out our cucumber and melon plots behind it, you can see the site. I was overjoyed to see, as I pulled in, is the arrows show you the green patches. So these are our resistant cucumber cultivars. So it's bred in New York, but it's not just something that works in New York. It's something that is also really holding up in some of the severe disease pressures in some of the main cucumber producing regions in the nation. And with this, and one of the backstories with it that is exciting is often as people think about the timeline for introducing a new cultivar. So for us, this new Downy mildew resistant line, 401, it's something that I've showed in some other talks is much higher yielding when Downy mildew is there. Of course, it's still alive, but also has some competitive earliness. In the initial cross we did in 2012 to take what was a later but robust disease-resistant breeding line, this 264, cross it to Dasher, which is one of the most commonly grown slicing cucumbers around. That cross in 2012, we were doing selections in the field in 2013. We can have the benefit of a couple of generations a year using the greenhouse space. We had a selection that we were really confident about in 2015, was out in a couple trials as a really preliminary stage. Our release just came out last week, and so the publication of its existence is just coming out. And also there's a seed company that has it licensed, did a seed production this summer, and so this is something that we started the process in 2012. It's going to be available to growers with a specific focus on the southeast where they really need it most next summer. And so this is a really rapid response system where is it really fully finished? Can we do more with it? Certainly. We're going to keep working on it. That's in part why we're giving them these numbered lines and not names yet, because these are still going to be works in progress, but that doesn't mean that a grower can't really benefit from having this tool on their farms now, right? And so we've just continued to release things as soon as we have something that we know is an improvement, try to fast track that, get it out to the growers. Okay. And while that is something we're proud of and seems fast on that scale, there's also something that could be even faster. Some of the sources for Downy mildew resistance we're using are things that are cultivars that are, well, they're cultivars, depending on where you are in the world. Right? That was the key to much of our resistance breeding, is taking different cultivars that had moderate resistance, bringing that together and getting an even higher level of resistance. And so looking through some of these cultivars, you'll see there's some Chinese cultivars that are grown in parts of the world where these pathogens are endemic. There are also Indian cultivars that are also being grown in parts of the world where some of these pathogens are endemic. And so these are existing cultivars that are fit with existing cuisines around the world. And while we can spend a lot of time adapting these, doing some breeding to be able to kind of take that resistance and introgress it into some of the market classes we enjoy, there's also the potential for these to be enjoyed right now and to help to diversify, to share more broadly just how well they might do. Many have excellent yield. We've done high tunnel, open field trials with them, and the flavor is great. Sometimes the flavor is different. Sometimes it needs to be used differently in the kitchen, but these are still cucumbers that can be grown now and enjoyed at least while we are at certain times of the season when it's difficult to grow the other cultivars, or while we are continuing to make it to do the breeding process to introduce the resistance into the market classes we enjoy. Okay. And so that's really looking at some of those aspects of the breeding process and where we can interact. Another opportunity and that has increasingly drawn attention, so here's a study by the NRDC, is just looking at the amount of produce that is harvested and then just never really makes it into into our diets, and never makes it into our bellies, and a variety of reasons. Sometimes it is oversupply, and so there's often, to make sure a grower can meet a contract, they will produce more just to make sure they can have that supply. Much of what's overproduced might end up in a landfill. Something that doesn't look like you might be expecting to fit that market class concept might end up in a landfill. And so as we've been starting to look at some of the different ways we can improve this, again, we've taken the lead from our great collaborator, Chef Dan Barber, and this is his salad collaboration with Sweet Greens. It's been a big inspiration to us in how we start to think about also how we can change some of the attributes we're breeding for. Okay? And so this is their salad, where it is essentially what you might have left over on your cutting board after you make a salad. So it is broccoli stems, carrot peels. You see the leaves from some of the brassicas that actually do make a fine salad. They're all edible parts. This was celebrated in a salad at Sweet Greens, where it ran for a while, just really looking at, even as we have the harvested plant parts that come in, and whether we or not we choose to use them, how can we be able to change our approaches to be able to use more of that? And so, there's part of it that can happen through culinary trends and how consumers, the public, approaches what to do with the produce they bring home, and it can be, introduced to them in these ways. But also for me, as a plant breeder, I'm then increasingly starting to think about, so what about all these other components of the produce that I'm not selecting for? So I'm always selecting for the best fruit quality. And as I tried to get over the hurdle with the tromboncino and how that was something that wasn't really fitting with my concept of what I was going for in a butternut squash, we were going for a straight neck, small, really sweet, then to be introduced to this long, windy squash. It took a little while for me to be able to really realize the potential of doing the breeding work with it and how it really fit into the food system in a more sustainable choice. So looking at the underappreciated components in this salad, the part where it's kind of come home to some of the breeding and selection I've been doing is I find myself going through a squash field, tasting many more parts of the plant than I ever would have imagined even a year ago. Then Barbara started to tell me how it was, I should be doing this, and how we would be, and how there's this potential to breed for the flavor of the stems of a squash plant, the leaf petioles. And again, this was something where he helped me really kind of think more broadly about what we could be selecting for. And for me, what converted me was sampling the dish. So the nearest to me is a cucurbita pepo penne pasta, where it is the leaf petioles of the squash plants that is prepared. If you look for a gluten-free pasta, this is 100% gluten-free. It's just the leaf petioles. But there's variation within squash, so some actually don't taste very good, some are okay, and some actually do have good flavor. And so as I've gone through the field and doing a lot of selections, one of the key places you can really see this can impact sustainability is at the end of the season. Here's a panorama of a squash field, and you can see on the side nearest me on the right, you see the typical loss of plants that are succumbing to powdery mildew, even despite our breeding efforts. At some point they senesce and go down. There's also some other species from other parts of the world that I have growing on the left. These are naturally adapted species, and some of the breeding work we start to do with them, and you can just see they are still green, vibrant, growing. This was at my house in October. You could only imagine in a little bit more milder part of New York, they would have been growing just fine, probably up until maybe, today, last night. Right. And so this is, so the ground is being used, it's being planted, growers can harvest the fruits, but at the end of the season, or as they are just having a succession of plants, there's really a lot of food out there in the field. And so as we've gone through and learned how to be able to do some of the sampling, or kind of realize that this is a great thing we can do, it can only have some benefits, right? And so there's also an emphasis on learned, right? So I learned this from a chef, and sort of this sort of approach in some of the cultivars we're using, it's something that's not new to the world, right? And so in many parts of the world, this is part of the culture. This is part of the cuisine. These plants are eaten, the whole plant, in many other different countries. And so for us, it's been a matter of kind of learning those cultures, learning those traditions, appreciating the value they have and how it contributes to sustainability, food access, and those parts of the world. And just kind of really starting to enjoy and celebrate those opportunities. And for us, of course, as a plant breeder, there's also, as we look into some of these crops that are growing in much warmer parts of the world, still there's an opportunity to adapt them to more thrive in our parts of the world, in the Northeast. It'll be very different from when they're originally grown, right? But so this is learning from other cultures, kind of getting some more diversity in, and being able to appreciate some of the plants, as they come from many different places of the world, and there's definitely some breeding that can be done, but also there's value as they are. Right? And so some of the themes I wanted to focus on today is to be able to have a more efficient breeding process. There's an opportunity cost in waiting until something is finished and restricting ourselves to this is exactly how it needs to look in the marketplace. So what diversity, what potential is there to have uniqueness, and how can it be used to actually drive consumption? Right? And so increasingly some of the approaches we use as we look in how to take something that's working well now and just get ready access to a grower. So on-farm trials as pilot production. And so as we start to do our on-farm trial work, there's often an idea that, okay, it'll be available later when it's commercialized. As we can commercialize some of the cultivars, some of the breeding lines that are actually doing well now, that gives growers immediate access to it. We're not going to have them risk their whole farms to it, but they can certainly be able to take a portion of their land and be able to have something that might work better and work into more land for it as we continue to improve it. Right? And that's because before it's finished cultivars, there's often some value. Right? Breeding for reduced waste, learning from other food cultures on what are the other parts that are used, how are they consumed, what makes them delicious, how can we be able to look at what we're growing and be able to apply some of the same, and also maybe try some of those cultivars here to see what we can do to introduce those. And with that, as we can get some culinary trends led by a chef, to look at how we can be able to take those cultivars that were adapted now, are working really well, and be able to hopefully start some culinary trends that can embrace that diversity, because those are things we can eat now that will have a much greater sustainability even before the breeding process starts here, and to really embrace the breeding process that's been going on for the many years to get it to the state it was as we experience it from those other parts of the world. Right. And so with that, I'd like to thank the graduate students in my lab. I showed quite a bit of work, Lauren Brzezowski, former postdoc Brian Leckie, and a fantastic group of graduate students and postdocs in the lab, some great technical support to make everything come together. And a big thanks to Chef Dan Barber at Blue Hill that's really led us as we've learned to explore things, explore vegetables a little bit more bravely than we were before. And lots of great collaborators that have helped or we've helped with some various aspects of what I've shown, and a great support from USDA, NIFA, and some other funders. So, thank you.
Questions? You had
No. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
had one slide that showed 5 years to cross to.
Yeah.
To
From 2012 to 2017.
Could you
Yeah.
pull up that slide?
Sure.
It looked to me like maybe should it have been 6.
Did I skip one?
I want to say it should be 6. I guess the F1 and the 264 are synonymous. Is that agreement?
Well, no. So we're getting 2 generations a year of this. So the cucumber, we can get multiple generations a year. We can even squeeze it to 3. And so that's what really helps us be able to push it forward quickly.
Thank you.
Yep. Zach and then Marcus. Yeah.
Are there any risks associated with hurrying the production to the grower, you had more time, you could maybe find a more durable resistance, or is there any downside to that?
Yeah, and I guess maybe I should repeat the questions. And so there's a question about if there's hazards in rushing something to a grower, and if there might be some more durable resistances, other progress. So I think it's just in kind of rushing it to a grower. I think the considerations are, they might be losing production now. They might have given up on a crop completely. As we talk to some growers in the southeast, they've given up on summer squash, zucchini entirely. And so in that system, being able to share something that might work, we won't suggest they'll plant their whole farm to that. That would be a huge risk. But to put in a row and see how it does. And so it's just really those exploratory plots, kind of getting them at a scale, an appropriate scale, where they can be introducing them to their production, and also at the same time then they have enough to test market. And start to be able to build that following before they take something new and novel and introduce it on a large scale. So it does have to be balanced, but I think it works. Yeah. And Marcus?
So on that kind of same note, with the new varieties and new colors, the seeds,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel like it's super crucial to get it into the restaurants because that's exposing it to people who then want to buy it in the store?
Yeah, and I think it's in terms of culinary trends. So kale was so that's Chefdriven trend. I think the baby leaf lettuce, and how that's similar to the peas, and so that's something that provides loft to a salad. So as we moved away from iceberg lettuce to all these baby greens, it's something that's actually much more sustainable for a grower and gives them some opportunities. So, how many farms do we see now with high tunnels that are, growing greens year round, and they're not just doing one market class or type. They have multiple different species, families, brassicas are being mixed in, and so there's great diversity of leaves going in, and so, that's something that got a lot of its push from, the chef community. Yeah. Yeah. Any questions in Geneva?
I got one.
Yeah.
One of the intermediate steps in getting into the growers is getting into the seed companies. They tend to want a certain volume of sales before something is worthwhile. How do you have that conversation?
We have been working with some seed companies that can kind of see a real critical a way to address a need now. And so some of these are ending up in more regional seed companies that do not need to have thousands of pounds of seed, but can do it at a much smaller scale and be able to kind of get it out now. So as we have field days throughout the Southeast, it's attended by many of the Southeast seed companies. Many of those are picking up some of these varieties now. They can see it's starting to work well in a region in need, and their seed production can also be kind of their last proof in the trial. So it's otherwise it is being able to convince someone to take the plunge in something radically new. That's why we need some more of the pull through help. Sure. Anything else from Geneva before I move to a couple here? Yeah. Hey, Bruce.
In your presentation, you didn't say much about genetic studies and markers,
Mm-hmm.
selection, genomics, but
Yep.
some of the titles of your grants suggest you're operating in this area. Can you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about your interactions in genomics, marker system selection?
Yeah, sure, and I didn't focus on it here. There's I did a talk in plant breeding a couple weeks ago that really focused on much of that, and so that should be up on YouTube now. So again, for the people on the screen at home, it'll be hopefully in the list there. A lot of the work we're doing there is genomic selection, is a really great and promising tool for us right now. And so we've been doing genomic selection for quality in winter squash. The next step is storability, because we'll have the whole crop cycle is 1 year to be able to fully evaluate the storage of those, to go from when we plant them to when the last ones come out of storage. And so that's going to be a huge help. We will be looking at the gains we've been able to make next summer, but so far it's very promising, and we're seeing the gains being made. And again, that's one that kind of fits in as we've had the intermediates in the genomic selection process. We've been distributing a lot of butternut squash from that, which are all, I think, hopefully being received very well. And so they're already high quality. They are diverse. There's mixtures of fruit sizes and some qualities and shapes, but they're still a very high quality produce. And the other major areas with the striped cucumber beetle, starting to look at the genomic context. So what is the reason for that subspecies difference in beetle preference? And we've been focusing on F2 populations, biparental populations, because the population structure for an association study precludes that. We are studying the substructure, and so we had to mix that up. But so we've done that, coupled with starting to look at RNA-seq to see and using some of the new 3' quantitative methods to look at the gene response for beetle feeding and what's going on between those, cucurbitacins, and also just some other volatiles and other maybe anti-feedant metabolites. And the thing that we're very proud of, and was just accepted this morning, the powdery mildew resistance that was famously done by Henry Munger here at Cornell for cucurbits, so moving the wild species introgression from Cucurbita marnesii into Moschata and Pepo, and a key attribute in much of the breeding that's been done here. So we are the first to have a published, publicly available marker that's so far completely co-segregates with the trait. And we were very excited about how we did that approach, because rather than creating a lot of populations for ourselves, we just took advantage of the populations that were already there. And so as we had that resistance gene that Henry Munger did and shared throughout the world, dozens of breeding companies, hundreds of plant breeders working on that for probably millions of meioses. And as we've been able to just genotype what's resulted from that, the one region they share in common is a 75 kb interval, about 75 kb, with a couple really promising candidate genes that we're now following up. So those are the types of studies we're doing. There'll be another video that kind of summarizes all those, but this was really just looking at some of the art behind it and some of the other opportunities to change how we do what is otherwise kind of an established pipeline. No, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, Rachel.
I had a question about the striped cucumber beetle work.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the golden zucchini being much more preferred by
Yeah.
consumers at market.
Those are the zucchini type, that subspecies, yeah.
Right, and you posed a sort of offhand question, which was how will we know when we can be close enough to the market preference?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you have a sense already of how close you'll need to get, or if not, how you plan to go about getting the information that would inform that decision.
So the question here was, as we're crossing these two, and we are trying to go toward being able to put the non-preference from the summer squash into the kind of more consumer preferred market class of the golden zucchini, how are we going to know when we're close enough? So that will be something that will be, in part up to kind of consumers, and as we're sharing some of the intermediates with growers, if they are being able to market it. There are some subtle flavor differences. There are some other characteristics that might come along for the ride. It will probably in the end just be a match of the visuals if we've kind of converted it over. And also, there are some culinary differences that we can also No, we'll taste a lot of squash. Yeah. Thanks. Is there any time for more? Yeah.
Considering your work with Blue Hill Farm
Yep.
and the popularity that's resulting from that, do you see a rise in breeders working with owner enrolled and actually helping these varieties?
Yeah, and so there's a conference in 2013 that really helped get a lot of that going, and kind of a much greater visibility to the potential there. So yeah, it's increasingly, you'd see the chef breeder interaction going, which has been really exciting. And it's a way to be able to capture the creativity from both sides and be able to work directly, so there's actually two ends of the process that are coming together. Yeah, thanks. And Hannah, did you still have a? Oh, okay.
How we begin to measure market class.
And I think the thing I'd be arguing is, to what extent can we be able to move beyond that a bit, and just have, so what other, as people think about creating new market classes, is kind of, when is something just great as it is, and you can introduce that. And that was, with a honey nut squash, a miniature butternut squash was not something that really fit into the market. It was small and looked different, and it tasted really good, but it wasn't until people really got introduced to it that it got popularized.
Join me in thanking Michael.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.